Bitcoin will not go to 1 million anytime soon. I disagree here with George from CryptosRUS. I like his content, I like George's content, but I have to disagree on his take that ETFs might propel Bitcoin to 1 million. It's because of this very long-term gold chart. It's a gold chart relative to the S&P 500. But before we look into this, let's first look at George's take.
You know, in case you guys are curious what a Bitcoin ETF can do for Bitcoin, well, this is what the first gold ETF did for gold after it came out. You could see gold. If you thought Bitcoin is boring, look at gold. Since 1980 to all the way to 2001. It's like 20 years, over 20 years where gold was flat until the introduction of gold ETFs. Okay, so it's Bitcoin does not look like that. Bitcoin has been trending upwards and upwards and upwards and upwards. But if you look at where gold was before the ETF introduction and where it ended up afterwards, including today, right? Well, then you put two and two together and you'll realize that, hey, this may be coming for Bitcoin. It could be driving Bitcoin up to 150, 200, 250,000 this bull run. And then who knows where the next bull run will be, where Bitcoin could be at 500,000, $750,000, $1 million. Imagine one day when you wake up and you check your portfolio and you realize that Bitcoin is at $1 million each. Forget your entire portfolio. That Bitcoin is at $1 million each. That's a real possibility within our lifetime. And I'm not talking about 50 years out or 100 years out. I'm talking about within the next 10 years. By 2030, Bitcoin could be at $1 million each. And
so $1 million by 2030. What kind of a return would this actually be annualized? So let's take this 1 million, divide this by 30K and put this to the power of 1 divided by, let's say 7 years, right? 2030 is 6.5 years, but let's say 7 years would be annualized 65%. Historically, if we include the very early days of Bitcoin, where Bitcoin was just a few cents, from that time to today, Bitcoin did make 80% per annum. Even more than those projected 65%. Nowadays, Bitcoin is way larger. I have my doubts that we can still achieve these massive growth rates. And let's look at the comparison to gold and the introduction of the gold ETF. I think it's very important to keep a realistic picture of what future performance might look like. Because otherwise, you might be disappointed, right? Let's say Bitcoin only goes up by 20% per annum. You're still outperforming stocks massively. You're still outperforming property massively, at least unlevered property. It would still be a nice outcome. So there is no real need for Bitcoin to hit 1 million in order to be a worthwhile investment. Let's have a look at this long-term, very long-term gold chart. This is not the pure gold price. This is gold divided by the S&P 500. And look at these very massive waves. The first vertical line that we see over here is Bretton Woods. So this is when fiat stopped being backed by gold. So a lot of people were scared of holding fiat and moved their money into gold. And so gold outperformed even the stock market by 1,700%. Then came the tech boom. And so stocks outperformed gold massively. Gold lost versus tech stocks by 97.6%. Do you see how massive these moves are? It really matters if you are in gold or in stocks. If you want to time this, right? If you allocate somewhat significantly to either portion. Then came the crash of the dot-com bust. People looked for safety, and this is when we got an outperformance of gold versus the S&P 500 by 800%. And the arrow over here, this is when the Spider Gold ETF was introduced. So this is the rally that George talked about in the video. The outperformance of gold versus the S&P 500. And this is really what we should be looking at here, right? We shouldn't be looking just at US dollar valuations, because if all of money expands, it doesn't really matter in what kind of hard asset you have your money in, right? We are now looking at the effect of the ETF introduction potentially, not at the effect of lowering interest rates or monetary expansion. So if we are very generous, then the ETF introduction brought in 320% of alpha, right? 320% of outperformance. That is not just fiat inflation. So that's a 4.2x. And this is a perfect timing here, right? You would be selling at the exact top. 4.2 times 30 or 30,000 is 126,000. And that's over the span of 7 years. 4.2x of alpha over the span of 7 years is 22.7%. That's the outperformance that at the very best this ETF introduction of gold had on the market. So it's really important to keep level-headed. Have your capital in several different asset classes. Of course, allocate to Bitcoin. I also like to have substantial amounts of my wealth in Bitcoin, but also own stocks, also own property. Take advantage of the relative capital movements over time, right? These waves are massive. Gold relative to the S&P 500. If you shift some of your gold to the S&P 500 when we are up here, and you shift some of your S&P 500 to gold when we are down here, then you do make gains. Currently, gold relative to the S&P 500 doesn't seem to be performing too well. And part of that reason is probably because the younger generation is now allocating rather to Bitcoin as an alternative to gold. So I'm not arguing the bullish case of Bitcoin, but I am arguing a $1 million Bitcoin in 7 years, or in even 6.5 years, right? 2030. I'm all in for staying positive, but I'm even more in for staying realistic. Don't have overhyped expectations. It doesn't change the case that Bitcoin is a good investment, but don't expect to get massively rich just by owning one Bitcoin. Try to accumulate as much as possible. Dollar cost average in regularly, especially during the down moves. Bitcoin will recover. Long-term holders are not selling during downturns anymore. The number of holders that hold at least one Bitcoin is steadily creeping up. We now have 1 million wallets that hold at least one Bitcoin. Things fundamentally look very bullish. Simply don't get overhyped. If we do see a bull run, then sometimes take profit if you are over allocated to Bitcoin. If Bitcoin runs up by 5x, and take some of that money and move it back into stocks. Have a balanced portfolio, even if we are in some of the asset classes sometimes overperforming. Rebalancing is a real thing. Risk management is really, really important.